Welcome to South Asia Chat. I'm your host, Dr. Imran Ahmed, a visiting research fellow here at ISAS. Today we'll be speaking about Pakistan's national security policy. The National Security Policy was formally launched in early January this year. The document elaborates the Pakistani state's 5 year national security vision and lays down some guidelines and steps to achieve important goals focused on the safety, security, and prosperity of its citizens. It's the first policy document of its kind, and according to the shorter, public version of the document, suggests that it was 7 years in the making. Here to help us think through some of the issues and themes the document presents, as well as other related matters, is our very own director here at ISAS, Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevea. Professor Iqbal, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Imran.
I was wondering if you could provide some background on the document. We often think of Pakistan's security imperatives are drawn up behind closed doors in Rawalpindi, where generals and commanding officers set the agenda, lay out the terms, monopolize the decision making, and play their cards quite close to the chest. What prompted this public disclosure, involvement, and why now? And is it suggestive that Pakistan's security policies are moving towards greater civilian control and oversight?
As you noted, to start with, Imran, the National Security Policy, or NSP, is a statement of the national security vision of Pakistan that was released in January 2022, and it aims to cover the period from 2022 to 2026. Two points about it that you've already alluded to, which are worth highlighting again, is that this has been in the making since 2014. So it's been 7 years since the process of this started. There have been consultations with regards to Pakistan's security imperatives and its future vision. And these student bodies have been consulted, academics have been consulted, and select sections of the public have been consulted as well. This is a very interesting element of the formulation of this security document. However, it's also worth noting that the parliament was not part of this process of formulation of these ideas or discussions of this, and this led to some controversy, which we can discuss if you like to. And you've also rightly noted that the publicly available version of it is the shorter version of it, which goes about 55 to 60 pages. There is a longer version, which is about double the length, which is still classified, and which would probably be more revealing about certain ideas about how to achieve the issues that they've discussed. You've also rightly noted that this is the first time there is a comprehensive statement about Pakistan's national security vision. The word comprehensive should not be taken lightly because this document does cover a number of issues, both relating to traditional and non traditional security. And these range from issues relating to national cohesion, health security, internal threats and terrorism, asymmetry in conventional weapons with India, Islamophobia, the need for sustainable food systems, etc. But I would also at the same time like to highlight that this is not the first iteration of a vision of national security formulated in Pakistan. I'm just give you two examples. Under General Pervez Musharraf's regime, there was the Vision 2030, which had emphasized the importance of economics to national security of Pakistan. During the government of Nawaz Sharif, there was a national internal security policy which grappled with means of dealing with internal security threats as well. So, in that sense, this document did not arise out of a vacuum in itself. But having said this, I do agree that this is a comprehensive statement. Now, if we look at the document itself, it describes itself in very interesting ways. The terms used to describe it in the document are that it provides a bold vision, it specifies big ideas, and it states that it provides a citizen centric approach to national security. And the crux of this is that it's placed economic security at the core of comprehensive national security. Now, that's a little bit of a backdrop to what the document is and what it grapples with. To address your issue of the context in which it's arise, the timing of it, and why now. I feel there are three contextual points that we need to pay attention to. The first is the fact that Pakistan needs to understand and define its place in the changing world order. This is specifically in regard to the context of America's shifting priorities in South Asia, but also the Indo Pacific. This also relates to Pakistan's own attempts to balance the United States and China, its long term allies. And if we just look again at the wording of the NSP itself, we find that it's framed in a way that seeks to position Pakistan, in the words of the national security policy itself, beyond camp politics of the Cold War, and yet seeks to define convergence in trade, investment, energy security, and intelligence cooperation with the US, China, and beyond. So that's the first contextual point. The second contextual point is the need for Pakistan to clarify its own position vis a vis developments in Central Asia, and Afghanistan here being a gateway to Central Asia. And as we know, developments in Afghanistan have a geopolitical impact on Pakistan itself, but also they impact internal developments within Pakistan. And here I specifically referring to internal threats or the issue of militancy from the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. The third contextual point, and this speaks to why economics is at the center of much of this documentation, is that Pakistan has a very real economic problem. There are high rates of inflation. There is a massive current account deficit. Pakistan has been over reliant on foreign loans, and some of these loans, as is the case with the IMF loans, come with terms attached to it for the government to put in place certain economic and socio-economic policies which are not necessarily popular with the voters or the populace of Pakistan itself. Beyond this, Pakistan is also grappling with the fact that it has a limited position in global supply chains, and there is a need for it to diversify and expand its exports. And if we look at the document, these three, in my view, these three contextual points frame the discourse that we find in this document itself.
Thank you so much for wonderfully placing the basically the release of the document into context. I like what you said about basically clarifying its position in relation to the developments in Central Asia, explicating its position and ideas on a changing world order, and sort of um, relating almost sort of like signboard of saying, discussing some of its internal as well as its economic threats and priorities. I wanted to delve a little bit further into some of the main features of the document. So, one of the things that struck me was that the document is quite inward looking. A good portion of the document is aspirational in its nature. And like you mentioned, there's a recognition of the traditional elements of national security, such as defense, territorial integrity, internal security, and diplomacy, and non traditional elements related to economic health and citizen well being, and the placement of economic security at the core of the plan. Now, one of the things that you mentioned that this national security didn't sort of come out out of a vacuum, but sort of is a buildup of earlier national security frameworks. Um, is the fact is the fact that the economic security is at the core of this particular plan, is that a significant development or policy reorientation? And why do you think that the economy acquires sort of the highest priority in this particular iteration of the document?
If we come back to the contextual points itself, the economic challenges for Pakistan are very real. There is a recognition of this issue in itself. As I mentioned earlier, the current account deficits have have increased. Um, and it's I like the way you phrase that question about in terms of reorientation itself, because I suspect one of the things that you may be alluding to as well, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this, is the role of the army within this as well, and if this signals a differentiation between geopolitics and geoeconomics as well. Now, it's important to note here, right, that the army has been involved in the framing of this document itself. But at a broader level, the army itself has emphasized the importance of geo This term has caught on in Pakistan security circles. If we look at the case of the Pakistani military, we find that the chief of the Army Staff General Bajwa has himself outlined the importance for Pakistan to clarify its own geo-economic vision itself, and he speaks about He's spoken about sustainable development, and its importance for environmental peace and stability, etc. So the army is part of this discourse. And here it's important to note, if you look at the military of Pakistan historically, the military is an economic player in Pakistan as well. It's not aloof from the terrain of economy itself, but it's also natural recognition that the more money a country has, the more money they spend on defense. Right? So there's a realistic angle to this as well. So in that sense, you cannot ensure, for want of a better term, traditional security without economic security. But having said that, there are some issues which are interesting of the current context of Pakistan, and here it's not just the economic context, but the social-political discourse that Pakistan is also witnessing at the moment itself. Um, and if we look at the economic discourse and the discussion about economic security within the national security policy, we find that it reflects at a broader level the socio-economic discourse of the Imran Khan government, and its emphasis on what it describes as human welfare, equitable economic development. And we find in the NSP a reflection of the approach of the current government in Pakistan to emphasize its role in providing welfare programs. Now, this could be the SR scheme, which is a social welfare scheme, or the Panagar scheme, which is the homes for the lower economic strata, etc. And in this sense, we find I'm very interested in not just the fact that economic security is at the center of much of the document, but the way in which the economic discourse is framed and national security discourse is framed as well. Now, to kind of exemplify what I mean here, um, I would like to just point out that the NSP identifies and frames three challenges that the Pakistan national security faces in economic terms, and these are, as framed in the document itself, external imbalance, vertical inequalities, and horizontal inequalities. And I find these three broad frames in which the NSP highlights certain issues to be very illustrative. Now, with regards to the first, external imbalance, this is a reference to the issue of higher foreign exchange outflow. And if we look at the document itself, it speaks about the need for Pakistan's prosperity, or the development of prosperity, to or rather the fact that Pakistan's economic development and prosperity in the future will be linked to its exploration of markets in Eurasia and Africa. So that's an interesting element itself about how it positions itself geoeconomically. The second framing device, vertical inequality. Here, the document primarily is referring to the gap between the rich and the poor. And this is where you see the parallel between the socio-economic discourse of the IK government, Imran Khan government, I should say, and the NSP. Because in the NSP, it's highlighted that vertical inequalities, of the gap between the rich and the poor, will be addressed by providing direct support. And this is, again, a direct reference to the welfare schemes itself. What I find most interesting out of this tree is the third framing device, the horizontal inequalities, what I describe as horizontal inequalities. And here, the reference is specifically to unequal regional development and regional aspirations. And this, the NSP argues, is to be addressed through development packages. They don't go into details about it, but this is alluded to in the. And for me, I think this is an important recognition of unequal regional development, but also the fact that now there is a recognition of the fact that it is or rather, the recognition of the fact that unequal regional economic development is linked to issues of internal security, and that these issues have to be dealt with more equitable distribution of development, etc. And this is a long held debate that's been going on in Pakistan itself. Now, if we if we turn to other economic issues that have been addressed in the NSP, we find that it also deals with issues about the future of the job market in Pakistan. And it observes, for instance, that just to give you one example, that the current jobs may be obsolete in the next 3 decades. And he calls for more investment in startups, in public private partnerships, and the creation of more high tech jobs. Now, whether this is realistic, given the current context, realistic aim is a different issue. This document is highlighting a vision, aspirational, as I think you mentioned earlier. There's also, interestingly, a discussion about the energy crisis in Pakistan, and it highlights the issue of low output. And there is a proposal of increasing renewable energy to become about 30% of the pool of Pakistan's energy production by 2030. So, in this sense, there's a broad net on economic issues that have been highlighted.
Thank you so much for unpacking the layers of the NSP's economic vision. I wanted to move to another dimension of the document that you sort of touched on, the internal and external threats and challenges to national security. In your opinion, what are some of the major threats to Pakistan's national security? And do you think the NSP addresses these adequately, correctly, or and with clarity?
Well, one of the important things about the document is that it recognizes and it discusses the big issue of internal threats and terrorism within Pakistan itself. And as I stated earlier, this is not novel to this document itself. This discussion has been ongoing. But I think the very fact that there is a there's an important aspect to the NSP that deals with the issue of social cohesion. And he talks about how social cohesion needs to be developed through the cultivation of national values, ethnic celebration of ethnic identities, religious, cultural, and linguistic diversity is interesting in itself. So the one of the terms that features in the NSP is the idea of unity in diversity, and the reference here is to religion, but primarily to ethnicity as well. Um, and this is an important discussion. This is an important discussion. I think this is a real threat that's been recognized, and it's been highlighted in this document itself. I also would welcome the idea that there is a level of acceptance that the solution to this issue partly lies in um, educational institutions, cultural institutions, and the need to develop a inclusive national discourse. Now, the reference clearly here in the NSP is to um, ethno, ethno ethnic movements in Balochistan, but also Pashtun movements like the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, and also the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP. Um, and it also, I found it interesting that the um, there is this recognition of this internal security threat, but also there is a recognition for the need to this internal security threat to be linked to a wider discourse of the digital world and cybersecurity. And here, the NSP itself states that they will implement a policy. The government will implement a policy promising swift and uncompromising action against those producing and disseminating hate speech and material. So there is a recognition of this problem here. Now, whether this is going to transcend into actual action is a different issue. So when you ask about, do I think the issues are being addressed, the important internal and external issues are being addressed, my response is that I think they've highlighted the issues. I would like to see how this is implemented at the ground level. Um, the other thing about noting about the NSP is that there is still a emphasis on the fact that subnational movements, such as what's going on in Balochistan and some Pashtun movements, is still within the NSP linked and seen through the lens of the interference or influence of foreign intelligence agencies. So that discourse is still there. There is still an attempt of framing these internal threats as actually emanating from external sources, and so that lens is still there. And so, how much of change this is going to bring remains to be seen. And of course, as we anybody who studies Pakistan is aware of, the idea of controlling many of these groups is far more complicated because of state collusion, state support, and patronage for some of these factions as well. Um, but it's a welcome discussion that's there with regards to internal threats. With regards to foreign policy and external threats, I see continuity on this front. I don't think there is any drastic change from Pakistan's previous policies. They may be couched in different language, but I think the key issues continue to be formulated. Um, I of particular interest to me is the attempt in the NSP to define, as I mentioned earlier, and sorry to repeat myself, but how Pakistan seeks to define its own position vis-a-vis the United States and China. And the NSP itself speaks about the way it's trying to break away from Cold War camp politics and develop new frames in itself. I think in this regard, the fact that foreign policy is also being spoken in terms of trade, investment, energy, security, and intelligence cooperation is an interesting framing of it as well. It is no surprise, I would say, that India remains the major concern, though India is not often mentioned in the document itself. But anybody who studies the region would know what this references to. There's also a discussion on the issue of greater connectivity with Central Asia. And here, Afghanistan is presented as a key to this greater connectivity. So while in terms of looking beyond South Asia itself, the much of the trust remains in continuing its continuing major ideas that have always been there. Perhaps I would say the one element that I found rather interesting was when it came to discussing Pakistan's role in the future beyond South Asia. There is a emphasis on it as a geo-economic player rather than geopolitical player. And here there's a reference to not only the Indo-Pacific region, but specifically Central Asia and Africa. So I thought that perhaps was a new orientation that's worth keeping an eye on.
I liked your point about the translation of, I guess, identifying these issues and the dilemma of how to translate them into action and in implementation. I want to come back to that perhaps later in our conversation. I wanted to ask you, so the NSP centers security in framing or imagining Pakistan's futures and potentials. Are there challenges in persisting with the focus on security? For example, does it still center the security establishment as the major promoter, defender, definer of national interests and aspirations? Do you see any issues or problems in this discourse?
This is a good question because it needs to be noted that there is no, although we've gone the terrain of geoeconomics with the NSP, there is no clear differentiation between, or there's no demarcation between, as you rightly point out, there's no clear demarcation between the realm of security and economics. In fact, they overlap with each other in this document itself, and there's no the economic interests of Pakistan are very much framed in relation to its security interests as well. But beyond this, right, there is no demarcation of the role of the military as being specific to certain terrain and not in other terrain itself. And this is not likely to change. The military in Pakistan has historically played a very important role in various sectors of the country itself. And maybe it's worth again highlighting that while there was consultation of certain sections of the public, the parliament was not part of this process. Right, elected officials were not institutionally part of the process of discussing this documentation itself. So I think that's an important qualifier here itself. And I guess it suffices to say that the army is very much part of the equation. Not only has the army, now military, I should say, made statements about the importance of the geo-economic vision, it's actually been part of the discussions of the economic future of Pakistan with business houses, business leaders, etc. as well. So I would say that the military is still very much part of the equation, and there is no real distinction being made between the economic and national security interests of Pakistan. In fact, they're collated.
Thank you for that. Moving towards foreign policy and international relations, you touched on a lot of this already, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more. So, Section 7 of the NSP outlines opportunities and challenges Pakistan faces with its neighbors and key international partners. It's unsurprising, perhaps, that India bears the focus of Pakistan's concern, and the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir continues to be at the center of tensions and suspicions between the two states. Are there any notable surprises or omissions in the NSP's outlining of Pakistan's foreign policy goals? I think you mentioned Central Asia was one element, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on your earlier points a little bit more.
Sure. In terms of surprises and omissions, I would say that I at a substantive level, I would not say that there are any surprises encapsulated in this document itself. India still remains at the core of its foreign policy and external national security interests. As I mentioned earlier, the India, although not mentioned in name, is still seen to be linked to internal threats as well. So there is a continuation of discourses at this level itself. On the Jammu and Kashmir issue, in my perspective, it's more of the same with the NSP. But I don't think we could have expected a drastic change on this issue. Anybody who was expecting a drastic change in Pakistan's policy towards Jammu and Kashmir and looking to the document for that, I think were misguided. This was not going to present that. The issue of Jammu and Kashmir is entwined at various levels within Pakistan's national consciousness as ways in which. So I didn't expect anything on that level. The NSP still links the Kashmir dispute or describes the Kashmir dispute as a vital national issue of vital national security interest. Um, perhaps I would venture to say that while I was expecting that, um, the I was hoping that there would be some discussion about foreign trade and connectivity with India beyond the Jammu and Kashmir frame. I mean, and here my reference is to the fact that any trade that did exist between the two pretty much came to a halt after India altered the political status of Jammu and Kashmir in 2019, and Pakistan took the step of a very visible step of ending such negotiations about trade deals and more trade negotiations or pacts with each other. Looking at the way the NSP is framed with regards to connectivity, the fact that connectivity is a major issue being discussed, the fact that it's talking about geo-economic, I think Pakistan needs to at some stage, or I feel Pakistan needs to at some stage address this issue of trade despite political differences and political tensions as well. Perhaps it needs to look at the playbook of India and China in that way as well. And I was hoping to see more. I wouldn't say that I was expecting to see it, but I was hoping to see. So that's one omission that I feel it needs to be addressed going ahead. And of course, this we should also highlight here, right, that the NSP is a work in progress in that sense. This is a vision till 2026, and it's on paper. It's supposed to be taken forward. Issues are supposed to be increasingly discussed as well and reviewed. Um, in terms of omissions, maybe another issue that I think that seems to have not received enough of interest is Pakistan's relationship with Iran. And given that there is this entire document is framed very much within the context of what's going on between Pakistan's positioning with regards to America and China, it seems to have skirted over the issue of Iran. There's very important economic and geopolitical relations with Iran that need more attention, given the context, not least given the context in Afghanistan as well. But I would say, right, one of the major things that's lacking in this document is it's an ambitious statement of vision. Where's the roadmap? What are the steps that are going to be taken to achieve these aims? Um, that's one of the major omissions in this document. And I guess one should say that it's a document that presents itself as a statement of vision for Pakistan, but this needs to be backed up with how this is going to be taken. So I would say that was one of the major omissions.
Thank you so much. I think you touched on an important point. Where's the roadmap? And I think that relates back to what you were saying earlier about actions and implementation. But you also mentioned that I guess this NSP document is something of a mission statement almost, and it's a work in progress. And given that it's sort of open to annual revision, I wanted to ask you how realistic how realistic you think the goals are that are set out in the document.
This is an interesting question. There are some statements which, for example, the idea of transforming into upper middle income country. That's given the economic realities, the context that is recognized by the document itself. These are very highly ambitious aims, given the time frame that this document pertains to as well. So that's just an example of this issue itself. I think, in addition to the fact that there is no roadmap provided for these issues, one really needs to look at how this is going to play out within the parliamentary circles now, because all of these aims, ambitions, etc., need concrete policies, and these concrete policies need to be framed very much in the legislative terrain. And herein lies one of the problems. One is that the parliamentarians were not part of the process of this formulation, and there's been some pushback of this in Parliament itself. Although I should also state here that much of the criticism in Parliament is not about the aims and ambitions of the document, but about the fact that Parliament was not part of the discussions itself. So that's an important caveat to the current debate. But the reason I allude to the legislative issue here is that if we look at the time frame of this document, it covers 2022 to 2026. This gives the government pretty much 4 years from now to deliver on these aspects, right? The current government in Pakistan has 2 years remaining because you're going to have elections in 2 years. So, if there's a change of government, will this document carry on? Will the NSP as a project still exist? Will it be reviewed? And if it's reviewed, what sort of priorities will change? So that's a big question mark on the document itself, about the time frame itself. Although, if you hear what's being said within Pakistan itself, in fact, many of those involved in framing this document have highlighted that this document itself is a culmination of earlier ideas. So there is this view that this is a vision statement that will be reviewed by future governments as well, and the hope is that it continues to be developed in that sense. So maybe we should approach it as a statement and work in progress rather than something with hard defined aims that will be implemented in the next 2 years or 4 years for that matter.
Professor Iqbal, thank you so much for lending us your time and expertise today.
It was a pleasure speaking to you, Imran. Thank you for having me.
You're listening to South Asia Chat. If you wish to learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg.